In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, naval warfare had become a brutal contest not just of firepower and strategy, but of endurance. By 1942, both the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy had learned a fundamental truth about this new kind of war. Aircraft carriers were now the heart of the fleet. Battleships had faded into the background. Whoever controlled the skies above the ocean controlled the future of naval power. But as aircraft carriers rose to dominance, so too did a new question emerge. It was not merely about who could build more carriers or who could launch more planes. It was about which navy could keep its carriers fighting. In that struggle, Japan would discover a difference that astonished its own engineers: the American carrier's ability to recover, repair, and return to combat at a speed that defied all expectations. When war erupted in December 1941, Japan held the clear advantage. Its carrier fleet was the most powerful and experienced in the world. The Japanese had pioneered coordinated carrier tactics, and their aircrews were the most skilled anywhere. At Pearl Harbor, they demonstrated their precision and power. 6 of their carriers launched hundreds of aircraft that crippled the American battleship line and shocked the world. Yet even at that moment of triumph, a subtle imbalance existed, one invisible to the Japanese admirals. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carriers were formidable but fragile. Built for speed and striking power, they sacrificed resilience. Their designs emphasized offensive capability over survivability. The hangar decks were open and spacious, ideal for rapid aircraft handling but dangerously exposed to fire and explosions. Armor was thin. Damage control was secondary. Japanese engineers designed their carriers with the assumption that major damage meant the end. In contrast, American designers had built their ships to absorb punishment and to be repaired when the worst happened. In early 1942, the U.S. Navy was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Only a handful of carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, and Hornet, stood between Japan and total control of the Pacific. Each of these ships was now precious. They couldn't afford to lose even one. And so, from the first months of the war, the Americans began refining the art of keeping their carriers alive, not just on the battlefield, but in the aftermath of every engagement. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the United States faced Japan in the first carrier versus carrier battle in history. It was a confusing, scattered fight. The Lexington was hit by 2 torpedoes and several bombs. Fires spread rapidly. Explosions tore through the ship. After hours of valiant effort, the crew was forced to abandon her. She was scuttled by her own destroyers. The loss was devastating, but the damage control teams aboard Lexington had held the ship afloat far longer than the Japanese expected possible. Reports of how long she resisted, more than 5 hours after the initial hits, were noted with disbelief by Japanese naval engineers. A month later at Midway, the difference became even more striking. The Japanese lost 4 of their fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu. Each was disabled by a handful of bomb hits. Once fires took hold on the hangar decks, they spread uncontrollably. The ships erupted from within, their aviation fuel lines and bomb stores turning them into floating infernos. Japanese damage control doctrine failed completely. By contrast, the American carrier Yorktown, struck multiple times by bombs and torpedoes, refused to die easily. During the battle, Yorktown was first hit by 3 bombs, losing power and listing. Her crew restored lighting, counterflooded to correct the list, and resumed operations within an hour. Later, she was struck again by torpedoes. Even then, damage control teams contained flooding and stabilized the ship temporarily. Only when she was struck once more by a Japanese submarine days later did she finally sink. The Japanese, who had assumed she was already destroyed after the first attack, were astonished to learn afterward that she had not only survived the bombing, but was almost back in fighting condition before the final torpedoes struck. For Japanese engineers analyzing post-battle reports, the implications were unsettling. They had always taken pride in craftsmanship and precision, but their ship designs prioritized performance over endurance. The American approach was different, pragmatic, industrial, and focused on survivability. Every major compartment on U.S. carriers was divided by multiple watertight bulkheads. Damage control training was relentless. And the U.S. Navy had something the Japanese did not: a logistics system capable of sending repair ships, floating drydocks, and trained crews to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. By the time of the Guadalcanal campaign, the contrast was becoming obvious even to those observing from afar. The carrier Enterprise, already damaged at Midway, was hit again during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942. A 550-pound bomb tore through her decks, killing dozens and knocking out key systems, but she didn't retire to the mainland for repairs. Instead, U.S. Navy engineers worked around the clock at a forward base in Tonga, then later at Pearl Harbor, completing major structural repairs in less than 2 weeks. When she rejoined the fleet, Japanese intelligence officers were convinced it had to be a different carrier. They couldn't believe the same ship could have been repaired so quickly. Japanese reports from this period frequently noted how American carriers reappeared impossibly soon after being damaged. It wasn't just a matter of ship design. It was an entire system working in unison. Repair ships, tenders, and floating docks followed the fleet wherever it went. Damaged vessels could be patched up at sea, refitted at remote anchorages, and sent back into combat in weeks rather than months. The U.S. Navy called it mobile service support, and it was one of the least glamorous but most decisive innovations of the Pacific War. Japanese engineers, by contrast, were trapped by geography and doctrine. Their major repair facilities were in the home islands or in a few well-developed bases like Truk Lagoon. When a carrier or cruiser was badly damaged, it had to make the long, perilous journey back across thousands of miles of ocean, often through waters patrolled by American submarines. Many never made it home. By late 1942, the Americans had learned to repair under fire, while the Japanese were losing ships that might have been saved. The psychological impact was enormous. The Imperial Navy's engineers and officers had once believed their craftsmanship unmatched. They had built their ships with meticulous precision, their engines with near-handmade perfection. But now, they faced an enemy that didn't need perfection, only speed, redundancy, and practicality. Even Admiral Yamamoto, Japan's greatest naval strategist, remarked privately that America's ability to restore fighting ships faster than we can destroy them was one of the war's most disturbing realities. It meant that no victory was truly permanent. Every carrier sunk or damaged seemed to be replaced almost immediately, and even those crippled in battle often returned to fight again, sometimes within a matter of weeks. By the start of 1943, Japan's carrier force was declining, while America's was expanding at a staggering rate. Behind that growth lay an industrial miracle and a fleet of floating workshops that made the impossible possible. Japanese naval intelligence began compiling detailed reports on the American repair system. They called it a system of mechanical regeneration, a phrase that captured their bewilderment. But they still didn't fully understand how it worked, not yet. In the next stage of the war, they would see it firsthand, as the tide turned and the U.S. fleet advanced across the Pacific, bringing its shipyards with it. As 1943 began, the war in the Pacific entered a new phase. The Imperial Japanese Navy, still dangerous and determined, had lost the strategic momentum it once held. The Americans were no longer defending distant outposts. They were pushing forward, island by island. Behind every carrier strike, behind every amphibious landing, another battle was being fought, the relentless struggle to keep the fleet operational. This was a war of machines as much as men, and nowhere was that clearer than in the U.S. Navy's astonishing repair network that now spanned the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese had built their war machine on precision. The Americans built theirs on production, mobility, and recovery. It was a philosophy of engineering born not from perfectionism, but from scale. an industrial mindset that could repair almost anything, anywhere, at any time. At the heart of this system were the floating drydocks, vast mobile structures that could lift entire carriers and battleships out of the water for repairs. They were feats of engineering in their own right, modular, self-propelled, and capable of being disassembled, and towed thousands of miles across the ocean. By mid-1943, these floating bases began appearing at key forward anchorages: Espiritu Santo, Naumea, Manus, and later Ulithi. Each floating dock was accompanied by a constellation of repair ships, hulking auxiliary vessels packed with welders, machinists, electricians, and engineers. These men lived aboard the ships, working day and night to restore damaged vessels. They carried their own machine shops, cranes, forges, and spare parts. They could rebuild engines, replace armor plates, patch torpedo holes, and even refit entire flight decks, all without a single ship having to return to the United States. This was the hidden foundation of the U.S. Navy's endurance. In 1943 alone, over 2,000 ships were repaired in the South Pacific. What astonished Japanese observers later was how invisible it all seemed. No great shipyard or industrial city stood behind these efforts. Only small, temporary bases hidden in lagoons and coral atolls, run with the precision of a factory floor. When American carriers like Enterprise or Saratoga returned from battle riddled with damage, their crews knew what awaited them. Repair ships would close in before the smoke even cleared. Teams of divers examined hull breaches, while engineers mapped out repairs within hours. Welding torches illuminated the night. Damaged flight decks were patched with prefabricated steel plates stored on floating barges. Every hour saved meant another plane in the air sooner, another mission launched before the enemy could recover. To Japanese naval engineers, the speed of these repairs defied reason. Their own carriers, damaged even lightly, were often immobilized for months. The Shikaku and Zuikaku, for example, had been among Japan's most powerful carriers early in the war. After sustaining bomb damage at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, they were withdrawn to Japan for repairs that took half a year. In that time, Enterprise, damaged as many times or worse, was hit, repaired, and returned to combat 3 separate times. The contrast grew even more pronounced after 1943, when the United States began its Central Pacific offensive. As the fleet moved north toward the Marshalls and Marianas, the logistical network moved with it. Bases like Pearl Harbor and Espiritu Santo remained vital, but now massive forward anchorages were created closer to the front. The greatest of these would be Ulithi Atoll, a lagoon large enough to shelter hundreds of ships, transformed almost overnight into the largest naval repair and resupply base in history. Ulithi had no docks, no cranes, no workshops when the Americans arrived. But within weeks, Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, had built floating piers, power plants, machine shops, and fuel depots. Floating drydocks the size of city blocks arrived in convoy, assembled piece by piece, and anchored inside the lagoon. Soon carriers were entering and leaving daily, receiving everything from engine overhauls to new flight decks. For the Japanese, watching from afar through intelligence intercepts and reconnaissance, the transformation of Ulithi seemed impossible. In their naval doctrine, damaged ships were to be withdrawn to homeland bases where trained workers and tools could be found. They had never conceived that a navy could bring its shipyards with it. This difference reflected not just design but culture. American warships were built with standardized parts and modular systems. Bolts, pumps, wiring, and structural components followed uniform patterns. A damaged section could be replaced by any spare from any depot. Japanese ships, on the other hand, were individually crafted, each one a work of mechanical art. Parts were often unique to the vessel, machined by hand, and impossible to replace quickly. This meant that even minor damage could take weeks to repair, if the right craftsmen and materials could be found. American engineers also benefited from an unprecedented logistical chain. Tankers, repair ships, and supply convoys flowed continuously across the Pacific. Specialized, Advanced base ships carried entire workshops, hospitals, and warehouses. For every carrier on the front line, dozens of support vessels labored unseen behind the horizon, ensuring it never lacked fuel, parts, or manpower. The Japanese Navy tried to replicate this system late in the war, but their efforts were constrained by limited resources and shrinking territory. Their great base at Truk Lagoon, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, became increasingly vulnerable to American air raids. When U.S. carrier aircraft struck Truk in February 1944, the results were catastrophic. The lagoon burned for days as dozens of ships were destroyed, along with vital repair facilities. After that, Japan had no equivalent forward base left. Meanwhile, the Americans only accelerated their operations. During the same period that Truk was lost, the U.S. Navy commissioned dozens of new repair ships. Auxiliary floating drydocks like ABSD-1 and ABSD-2 could lift entire Essex-class carriers out of the water. Each section of these docks weighed thousands of tons, yet they could be dismantled, towed by tugs, and reassembled at any point in the Pacific. Engineers who worked aboard them often said they felt like they were running mobile cities, complete with machine shops, hospitals, foundries, and power plants. One of the most remarkable examples occurred in late 1944. The carrier Franklin suffered massive damage after a Japanese bomb detonated on her hangar deck, killing hundreds and setting off fuel and ammunition fires. At any other time in naval history, a ship that heavily damaged would have been considered lost. Yet the Americans brought her back from the brink. Tugs towed the burned carrier to Ulithi, where floating workshops and repair ships immediately surrounded her. Within weeks, she was made seaworthy and sent to the U.S. mainland for final restoration. Japanese engineers later studied the Franklin incident with disbelief. They could not understand how such a crippled vessel had remained afloat, let alone been repaired. What they saw as mechanical miracles were, in truth, the result of systems and planning, a combination of standardized design, industrial logistics, and the ability to move repair infrastructure anywhere it was needed. Equally important was the U.S. Navy's training in damage control. From the first days of the war, every sailor was drilled in firefighting, flood control, and emergency repair. Crews could isolate flooding compartments, rig emergency power, and extinguish fires with ruthless efficiency. Japanese ships, by contrast, often lacked comparable training or equipment. The Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, was lost in 1944 after a single torpedo caused internal fuel vapors to ignite. The resulting explosion destroyed her from within, a tragedy that might have been prevented with American-style containment systems and damage control protocols. By late 1944, Japanese naval engineers finally realized the full scale of the American advantage. Intelligence officers reported that even carriers heavily damaged one month were appearing in new battle reports the next. To them, it seemed as if the U.S. Navy had developed an endless fleet. They described the phenomenon as reincarnated ships, vessels that should have been gone but returned again and again. This illusion of immortality had profound psychological effects. Pilots who struck an American carrier in one battle often found it still active weeks later. Commanders could no longer rely on attrition. Every blow seemed temporary. The Japanese had entered the war believing they could win through a few decisive battles. Now they were learning that the Americans could fight indefinitely, because they could repair indefinitely. By the time the U.S. fleet reached the Marianas in 1944, the system was operating at full capacity. Carriers like Enterprise, Bunker Hill, Essex, and Intrepid cycled through Ulithi's floating docks in rotation, receiving repairs while others fought. The fleet no longer had to retreat. It healed itself as it advanced. In the final years of the war, Japanese engineers finally captured fragments of American repair documentation from damaged ships and supply convoys. The reports left them speechless. What they saw was not technological superiority in weapons or armor. It was superiority in organization, logistics, and foresight. America's genius, they realized, lay in turning the entire Pacific Ocean into a moving factory floor. And yet the story of that factory, the moving machine that rebuilt the U.S. Navy at sea, was far from over. The climax would come in 1945, when some of the most brutal kamikaze attacks ever seen would again test whether the Americans could truly repair faster than Japan could destroy. By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached its most violent stage. The American advance had moved within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. The island campaigns of the Marianas and the Philippines had cut Japan's empire in half. Only Okinawa remained as the last major obstacle before the invasion of Japan itself. But as the U.S. Navy approached Okinawa, the Japanese military unveiled a new weapon, not mechanical but human: the kamikaze. The concept was simple and horrifying. Pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft, loaded with fuel and explosives, into Allied warships. It was a weapon born of desperation and belief, a final attempt to offset America's overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority. For the U.S. Navy, it meant a new kind of war, one fought not just against machines, but against men who refused to survive their attacks. During the Okinawa campaign, from April to June 1945, more than 1,500 kamikaze aircraft struck the American fleet. The damage was staggering. Dozens of ships were sunk, hundreds damaged, and thousands of sailors killed or wounded. The carriers, the very backbone of the fleet, became prime targets. Their large flight decks were easy to hit, and the fires from aviation fuel could quickly turn deadly. The Japanese hoped that by destroying the carriers, they could halt the American advance. But once again, the U.S. Navy's repair system proved decisive. When the USS Franklin was struck by two bombs in March 1945, even before Okinawa, the blast engulfed her hangar deck in fire. Hundreds of tons of aviation fuel ignited. The explosion tore through multiple decks, and secondary detonations destroyed aircraft, weapons, and ammunition. More than 700 sailors died. Any other navy would have written her off as a total loss. But the Franklin refused to sink. Her crew, trained exhaustively in damage control, fought for hours amid the flames. Entire teams were incinerated where they stood, yet others stepped in to take their places. The ship was kept afloat through a combination of discipline, training, and mechanical preparedness, exactly what the U.S. Navy had spent years refining. When tugs finally brought her to Ulithi, the carrier was nothing but a scorched shell. Yet within weeks, she was repaired enough to sail back to the United States under her own power. To the astonishment of Japanese intelligence, the Franklin's name appeared again in reports just months later. They could not comprehend how such devastation had been reversed. Throughout 1945, Ulithi Atoll functioned as the beating heart of this recovery network. At any given time, over 700 ships crowded its lagoon: carriers, battleships, destroyers, submarines, transports, and repair vessels. Floating drydocks worked without pause. Sparks from welders lit the night like fireflies. Repair crews rotated in shifts around the clock. When the Bunker Hill was struck by two kamikazes on May 11, 1945, her decks erupted in a chain of explosions. Over 350 men were killed instantly. The fires raged out of control. Yet just hours later, destroyers and repair ships were already alongside, pumping water, providing power, and sending in firefighting teams. Within 48 hours, the fires were extinguished. Within days, temporary patches were welded in place. Within weeks, she was underway again. The Japanese naval staff, receiving fragmented reports through intercepted communications, began compiling lists of damaged American carriers. Their analysts noticed a disturbing pattern. Ships they believed destroyed: Enterprise, Saratoga, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, Franklin, kept returning. Each time they appeared sooner than logic should allow. By May 1945, one Japanese engineer wrote in a report to the Naval Technical Department, The enemy possesses the ability to regenerate ships faster than we can sink them. They repair at sea what we must bring home. Their carriers are reborn. The difference was rooted not in luck but in planning. The U.S. Navy had designed its ships, its logistics, and its training around the assumption that damage was inevitable. Every system on an American carrier was built with redundancy, multiple power circuits, independent fire mains, sectionalized fuel lines. Damage could be contained, isolated, and bypassed. Even the hull design emphasized compartmentalization, preventing flooding from spreading. Japanese carriers, in contrast, were built for performance. Speed and aircraft capacity took precedence over survivability. Their ventilation systems often spread smoke and fuel vapors throughout the ship. Their hangar decks lacked sufficient armor protection, and their internal firefighting systems were limited. When disaster struck, it usually escalated beyond control. The kamikaze attacks at Okinawa exposed these differences completely. The Japanese inflicted tremendous damage, but the U.S. fleet absorbed it and continued fighting. By June, despite months of near-continuous suicide strikes, not a single American fleet carrier had been permanently lost. Every damaged carrier was either repaired on site, towed to Ulithi, or sent back to Pearl Harbor, and all eventually returned to service. The logistical network that made this possible was vast. Fuel depots, ammunition ships, floating hospitals, and supply barges formed a chain stretching thousands of miles. At the center were the repair ships, the unsung heroes of the war. Vessels like the USS Vestal, USS Ajax, and USS Prometheus operated as mobile factories, carrying everything from lathes and turbines to spare propellers. Their crews, numbering in the thousands, were master mechanics who could rebuild almost anything in open water. The Japanese Navy had no equivalent. Their few repair ships were confined to home waters by late 1944, and their supply routes were strangled by American submarines. The result was inevitable. Even minor damage could sideline a ship for months, while American vessels returned within weeks. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japanese engineers began studying captured U.S. naval documents. They found detailed manuals describing the modular design of American warships, interchangeable components, standardized fittings, and rapid repair protocols. To their astonishment, they realized that the U.S. Navy had planned for damage before the first battle had even begun. One post-war analysis by the Imperial Navy's Technical Research Bureau concluded, "The American method is not one of perfection but of resilience. Their ships are not invincible because they are strong, but because they are repairable." This insight became one of the enduring lessons of the war. In the years that followed, Japan's own shipbuilders, now working in peace, adopted many of the same principles. Standardization, modular construction, and rapid maintenance became central to post-war Japanese engineering, influencing industries far beyond shipbuilding. But in 1945, the lesson came too late. At Okinawa, Japan lost over 3,000 aircraft and much of its remaining naval strength. The Americans, battered but unbroken, had proven that their power did not rest solely on weapons or numbers. It rested on their ability to recover. The final act of the war confirmed this truth. Even after Japan's surrender, the Pacific was littered with damaged ships, many of them repaired once more and returned to service within months. The floating docks, the repair ships, and the Seabees who had built them faded quietly into history, but their impact remained immense. They had given the U.S. Navy something no other fleet in history had ever possessed, the ability to rebuild itself while still in battle. When Japanese engineers toured American bases after the war, they were shown photographs of Ulithi, hundreds of ships clustered in the lagoon, repair cranes rising from the water, aircraft lined up on rebuilt decks. One Japanese naval architect reportedly stood in silence for several minutes before saying, "Now we understand. You did not fight with ships, you fought with shipyards." That realization encapsulated the hidden power of the American war machine. The battles of the Pacific, Coral Sea, Midway, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa were fought with courage, but they were won with logistics. It was not just the will to fight, but the capacity to rebuild that determined victory. And so, as Japan rebuilt its nation from the ashes of war, it carried forward one of its enemy's greatest lessons. That strength lies not in avoiding damage, but in the speed and skill with which one rises after it. The story of how American carriers returned from the brink again and again remains one of the quiet marvels of World War II, a tale of engineering brilliance, industrial might, and human determination. A war of steel and fire that proved, in the end, that resilience is the most powerful weapon of all.